How about The Curse of the Black Monk? The devil in disguise is a constantly recurring theme in folktale. And the wickedest of all disguises for him is the cloak of piety. So here we go. There's now no fragment to be found to mark the place where the once proud castle stood, if indeed it ever existed in the reality of solid stone. All that remains is the castle rock, at the northern end of the wild valley called the Valley of the Rocks, and with it an age-old story of the doom-cursed family to whom castle and valley once belonged. Once upon a time, so the story goes, a magnificent castle stood upon this spot, 4 square and sturdy as only the Normans knew how to build. The castle owner was a knight of great renown, a favourite with the king, and a valiant warrior, though proud and avaricious. With his liege lord he raised the banner of the cross and set out for the Holy Land to rescue the holy places from the clutches of the infidels in the wars of the Crusaders. The knight left home and family, castle and domain to follow his lord. Time passed from months to years, and he didn't come home. Meanwhile his lady took his place and kept the affairs of her husband in good order against his return. One evening, as the lady sat in the great hall, word was brought to her that a stranger was at the gate, asking for alms and hospitality, which in the ordinary way was usually given, though sometimes grudgingly, by her lord. "What manner of man is he?" the lady asked. "Madam, I like not his looks, though he is a man of the church," replied her steward. "I will see for myself," she said, for monks had none too good a reputation in those parts or anywhere else just then. So she came to the gate and saw before her a tall, strong man with a long black habit, which couldn't conceal his powerfully built frame, and whose black cowl didn't mask his handsome though cruel face. The steward had been right, she felt. This was not a man to harbour willingly under one's roof in the absence of the lord and master. The stranger begged for alms in the name of the blessed Saint Mary, but the lady stood her ground and forbade either alms or admittance to him. Then the strange monk threw back his sable cowl, while his face grew even darker with anger. He raised his hand above his head and cursed the lady and all her brood. His voice shook with fury as he clenched his fist and proclaimed these cryptic words: "What is thine shall be mine, and so shall remain, till in the porch of the Holy Church a dame and a child stand side by side and beckon a sinner in." Then he strode away, and the lady and all her household felt a strange foreboding of evil yet to come. But as it happened, it wasn't long before her knight returned, unharmed from the holy wars. All seemed to be well in spite of the black monk's curse. However, the knight had come back hardened and embittered, and more avaricious than ever. Riches and treasure obsessed his thoughts during his waking hours, and at night filled all his dreams. Greed drove him to acts of cruelty and dishonesty that made his name a byword through the neighbourhood, and troubled much the conscience of his lady. He amassed such treasure that he feared for its safety, guarded though it was within his stronghold, and he began to make plans for adding new defences to the castle. But building materials were expensive and hard to come by, so he pulled down the church of St. John nearby, and used the stones to erect new turrets and battlements, new walls and gatehouses. And if that were not sacrilege enough, he took for himself the church's treasures of gold and silver, studded all over with precious jewels, and added them to the loot he'd brought back from his travels. All this plate was stored together within a massive iron-bound chest made specially for the purpose. Night after night the lord locked himself in his chamber and gloated over his treasures, while his lady wife grieved and prayed, and did her best to bring up her son and her little daughter in more Christian ways. One evening in winter, as the knight knelt before his treasure chest, he was aware of a dark shadow looming over him, cutting off the light of the torch that blazed from the cresset on the wall. Looking up, he beheld a tall, handsome, powerfully built stranger, clothed in a long black habit and a monkish cowl. As the knight cringed in awesome dread, the black monk pronounced his doom. The time had come when the knight must pay for his evil deeds, as the day of judgment inevitably falls for those who commit the deadly sins of greed and sacrilege. Terror-stricken, the knight began to scream for his steward, his guards, his men-at-arms, all those he'd housed for years to protect his property and his person. They heard him and obeyed his urgent summons at once, but even so they were too late. When they broke down the door of his chamber, they found only his dead body lying across the open chest of treasure, his face still contorted with the terror of his last living moments. The black monk had gone. Great was the grief of the lady and her children. Her son, the new owner of the castle and all that was in it, was by this time a fine young man. Her only other child was a girl, still an infant, of whom the young knight was particularly fond. To them the lady told the story of the curse put upon the family by the black monk. It seemed to the heir that somehow or other he must expiate the sins of his father, in order to free his mother and sister from the curse. What better way could there be than to take up arms again in the holy cause, and join the new crusade to the Holy Land? He armed himself anew with the latest of harness and the most tried of weapons, and all his retinue likewise. Then he bade a loving farewell to his mother and his baby sister, and he rode away to do battle for Christ on foreign shores in the east. Alas for the hopes and aspirations of youth! He was valiant, brave, intelligent, and courageous, but his spirit was neither old enough nor experienced enough to stand against the sense of doom that surrounded him, nor against the worldly temptations placed daily in his way. He fought many a fierce battle against the Saracens, and wrought valiant deeds with his sword, yet always at the moment of triumph over his enemies he'd look up to find the black monk at his side, wearing a sardonic grin on his gloomy, swarthy face. When the knight returned to camp with his fellows, and sat feasting while the tales of valour in the field were recounted, he'd find the black monk seated at his side, still leering from beneath his cowl at the thought of what was to come. Even in the softness of a lady's bower, when he had laid aside his harness for pleasurable dalliance with his chosen fair one, he would suddenly be aware of the uninvited presence of the black monk, sneering as always, watching and waiting. The knight grew depressed under the constant strain of this, and began to give up hope. What was the good of knightly chivalry, of valiant deeds, of self-denial, honesty, and clean living, if at the end of all that he was to be surrendered to the black monk, as the curse had foretold? He grew bitter and reckless. He indulged in the violent fighting no longer for the cause, but for his own vainglory and reputation as a warrior. He slipped into lascivious ways of greed, gluttony, and lust. His besmirched reputation went ahead of him wherever he journeyed, and tales of his wide doings and evil ways of life were brought back to Devon by other returning crusaders. When his mother and little sister heard them, they could scarcely believe their ears, or credit the truth of the tale-bearers. But as each report confirmed another, and every new tale bore fresh evidence that their loved one was going from bad to worse, they gave way to grief that made the proud castle they lived in seem the veriest palace of sorrow. The mother's frail health, weakened by all she had endured, soon failed her, so that she died. And bereft of mother and father, without hope of seeing her beloved brother again as she had remembered him, the little girl too lost her grip on life, and very soon let it go. Then the retainers of the castle buried her side by side with her mother in a tomb in the village church. At length, however, the time came when the Crusaders turned their steps homeward, and among them was a knight, notorious now, both for his valour and his evil reputation. Once landed in England, he made his way towards Devon, with the black monk as ever at his side. He was weary with travel, and tired of strife, as his horse climbed the last hill, and he looked down once more on the beautiful valley where he had been born. There stood the castle, sturdy and grim as he had remembered it. There lay the fields he owned, green and fertile in the beautiful light of spring. There stood the little grey church where he had sat by his mother, holding his tiny sister lovingly by the hand. He was moved, and reined his steed to a halt, while memories of his childhood flooded over him, and remorse filled his heart for all the wrong he'd done and the sins he'd committed since leaving his mother's loving care. As grief and sorrow flooded over him, he hung his head to hide the gathering tears. At his side the black monk chafed and fidgeted at the delay, and urged him towards the castle at all speed, to take possession at last of all his worldly inheritance. But then, just as the knight was about to yield to his dark companion's evil counsel, there stole from the church tower the first mellow tones of the evening bells calling in the faithful. The ringing tones, softened by distance, floated clear across the valley and completely melted the heart of the returning knight. He wheeled his horse in the direction of the church, and began to urge it forward, not towards the castle, but to where the bells were calling him home. Enraged, the black monk clattered by his side, endeavouring still by threat and promise to dissuade him, and to turn him aside from his purpose. But in vain. The knight rode resolutely on, till he was almost at the entrance to the porch. And there, suddenly, framed by the arch of the doorway, stood his mother and little sister, surrounded by a halo of most glorious heavenly light. Then as he gazed, his mother smiled upon him, a smile of such loving forgiveness that his heart leapt towards her, while both she and the child at her side began to beckon him to get down and to come to them. Then the knight shook off the strong retaining hand of the black monk, and with a glad cry of "Mother, mother, I come!" he dismounted and ran towards his mother's outstretched arms. But before he reached them or entered the church porch, he fell on his knees and cried, "May heaven forgive my sins!" Then the most glorious music broke all round them, as a radiance of light enwrapped all three figures, and even as it enveloped them, all three were borne upwards, till they dissolved to nothing against the blue of the evening sky. No sooner had the heavenly radiance faded, and the celestial music trembled into silence, than there came in its stead a flash of terrible lightning and a deafening roar of thunder from directly overhead. The black monk had turned his horse in rage and had just left the churchyard as the thunder pealed. Then the earth before him opened into a great fissure that ran from side to side of the valley, and the black monk, thwarted in his designs by a sinner's genuine repentance, spurred his horse and leapt right into the middle of it. So the evil one returned in rage and fury to the depths to which he belonged, and over his head the yawning gap closed again, but not before the castle in all its worldly might had crumbled to dust and slithered with him into the abyss. As years passed, the beautiful, fertile valley, now neglected, turned into a stretch of wild desolation. So it remains, called the Valley of the Rocks. In it there's now no trace of a castle ever having been there, nor is there a record of the name of the family so doomed by the curse of the Black Monk. Indeed, nothing remains but this old story, and when or how that began, nobody knows at all.